Estatia. Prologue. His descent became more rapid than expected. Bubbling water ripped past his ears and over his head. He bobbed in the emerald deep. As he rose, the water fled his eyes. The stony plated rock face looked down at him. A quarter of the way up was the promontory he had jumped from. There stood 5 or 6 figures. The morning sun gleamed on their bare skin. 4 strokes distance was Justin, standing in one of the motor launches from the docks. After hoisting himself sopping onto the boat, George Salt watched the girls climb the dusty stones towards the cliff top. "Was it a thrill?" Justin drawled. "I could go 3 more times, but you believe me now. There's no better spot for jumping." The air had cleared now that he'd been submerged, and fresh pine smells came down from the dark green trees on the rock face, where they stood planted like watching monuments. The water itself smelled green. "Where are the others?" George asked. Justin pointed behind him to the shoreline that glistened like scales. It was almost entirely shaded by pear and peach trees. "Take me over there." Once they'd motored to shore, George hopped off and looked back at the luminous shapes gingerly pressing the edge of the cliff. The women, George wondered, would they jump? The pebbles that made up the shore were soothing beneath his feet. He breathed the grassy, sweet air of the pear orchard. A few girls and boys sat farther down the beach, their conversation inaudible. It was very quiet on that island. The mountain George had just been under reached its arm down to become the pebble beach. All other sides of it were the unscalable faces of Mount Bronze. The stillness and lapping rhythm of the water soon evinced a sound which came from deeper in the forest. The others now stood and looked towards the trees. George called them to the boat. The 6 of them managed to fit into the launch. The sound was a padded thumping, undiscernibly sourced. George plucked a pear and shoved the boat away. All aboard, they stared into the boughs and brush. Something was moving branches. The thudding continued until they were clear away from Pebble Beach. They listened and bobbed in the mild current. There was a low, tubular wail. It went even lower and hummed on the water. Eric sat up and pointed at a swishing branch to the right. A whole tree moved, and Justin spun the boat towards their side of the lake. George later asked Maria, Justin, Eric, but none of them ever agreed about what it was that emerged from the pear grove onto Pebble Beach. That night on the shore, the group's own safe harbor on that lake, a bonfire was a crackle. Sodas kissed open and hot dogs were set to spits. Just on the threshold of orange light sat Starlock and Maria, talking in audible but indiscernible tones as they faced the water. George found himself on the dock, among the 3 floating launches. Pine smoke and sugar were in the air. His face still held the warmth of the fire. Though George thought the only sounds would be the whisper of the tide, he heard Starlock's words. "I know all those stories from childhood were true, but whatever parts of those stories we see now are usually just pieces or shades of the originals." "That's very true. It doesn't seem like we get full magic these days. That reminds me of one of the old verses. In the end there will be no sleep, for life will be as dreams were." With those words that sounded like a promise, George watched the moon promulgate down from the clouds and spread on the rippling water. He did not, however, expect to have fallen in love so swiftly. As he closed his eyes in the darkness of the night, George opened them again in the pacifying turquoise of morning. He'd gotten a bed in a secluded room of the cabin, and just to his right was an open window, out of which he saw the top of Mount Bronze, glistening with the dawn. Sausages cooked in the kitchen. George entered, and Justin Delegando showed him where there was a squat bottle of lemon killer stashed in the wall above the sink. Made from the gatherings there year after year, the concoction was cumulatively brewed and stored there. A swig, and its taste was violent at first, then mellow, then vaguely sweet citrus. At that moment, outside, a group of the men were sitting on the grass beside the water, their heads being shaved. When each were done, they'd plunge into the lake, as if to wash away the tasseled follies of school. While George ate, he noticed the tiny framed prints of fairy tale illustrations nailed to the posts and on the distant wall. Visions of dark, virile forests with maidens passing through, a large glittering sword and the like. The hopes of those scenes were alive again, with a swell of the heart at the recollection of Starlock and last night's opining. That day, the group took another trip out onto the water, this time to head into town. They raced across the water in the capacious speedboat. George stood on the bow in only his trunks while holding the painter, as if he were some Poseidian charioteer at the reins. They passed the tree-crowded islet of the Eagles, who made grand airies there. In the town of Greenville, low, sloping hills opened on a view of the church, the docks and the shops on Main Street. George dallied in a used bookstore and returned with a book by Robert Lauer. A bridge that crossed an inlet from the lake was a prime spot for boys to jump and fish. The man who corralled all of these young men and women was Bear Gunn, a mountain man and pastor who stood near 7 feet tall. Later that day, he got a bit sore with George and Justin, as they'd gone out on the lake while a storm was coming, and the wind had made the waves choppy. When each wave smacked the prow, George clutched the sides while Justin throttled and released the motor, trying not to swamp them. The adventure was worth it, though unnerving as it was, their potential doom presided over by the darkened figure of Mount Bronze. As the day went on, George heard talk among Justin and the other men that they would set out in the evening for Mount Bronze and spend the night atop it. "Not after what we saw earlier," said George. "Well, you can stay here. The pinnacle is hard to reach from the Pebble Beach side." Justin took his bag out with the others to a boat that was floating free and ready to launch. The other men stood in it, waving and joking at George. He wasn't really sure whether his vehement warning was warranted. It would turn out to be so. That evening, George was alone in the cabin, reading. He heard feminine voices coming around to the waterside. A group of the girls had decided to visit him, or rather to win his favor so that he might let them go in and spray the boy's stuff down with perfume. "I'll let you draw me," said Maria, exhibiting some ill-practiced allure. "All right, sit down here," George said at once. But she deferred to only doing so if he let all the girls inside. Now, such a sensational and perhaps scandalous idea didn't escape his fancy, but those girls clearly took George for a fool. He didn't budge, and their trivial plans departed with them. All that time, Starlock, who George feared was just as juvenile as the rest, stood at the edge of the group, not quite focused on anyone. She looked out towards the lake, and the mountain, or where it would have been in the darkness. As George sat back down to read, he reflected on a detail just noticed. Maria's hair was somewhat disheveled. Although it pretended to be rich and shining, it was merely spread out beyond its measure, thinned out towards her forehead, which completed her overall emaciated appearance. For a season, George had considered Maria as someone worth pursuing. This, the first of many disillusionments, felt the more sobering at the time. He held most of the women there in low esteem, as a matter of fact. George saw what he thought was a tenacious exclusivity that seemed to blot him out of the way of courtesy, a destructive camaraderie. He hadn't considered the notion that he should have minded his own business with the men. George flattered himself then that the girls would even deign to ignore him. But Starlock Hemmings did not diminish with scrutiny. No, she grew more special than the others. She, having stood just at the edge of that porch lamp, incongruous with their conceits, stayed luminous with her moon-shaded hair. George didn't recall when he went to sleep, but was awakened by the sound of his name being called. George realized as he sat up, a flashlight was beaming over his face from the window. The voice and owner of the latter was Eric. "We just escaped the island and hitched a ride with some drunk guy." George leapt to the door and let the bug-bitten young men into the living room area, where they sat and laughed for a few hours. The laughter came from an anxiety that was shaken from them like cold. According to Justin, after climbing the mountain at dusk and finding a place of even ground on which to set their blankets, a series of weird misfortunes hit them. The bugs and mosquitoes would have driven them mad alone. Then came the sound of something, like what they had all heard on the water off of Pebble Beach. Only there it was deeper, felt by all of them as it stepped closer. A tree shook, then bushes whipped. All of them scrambled down the hill, slipped on rocks, and fell with the dirt, until they reached the stone ramparts above the thrashing water. Their boat was lost in the darkness, and with uncertain monstrous doom at their backs, the 5 of them leapt down. They splashed and clung to the side of the rocks as larger stones and a tree were hurled past them. A light on the water came by. It was a small fishing boat that ambled near the rocks. The young men shouted and waved till their pleas were answered. But the rescuer was not the heroic salt that they had hoped for. Rather, the smell of gin overpowered any scent of fish that might have been on board. Jimbo, as he was called, steered them back and forth, getting close and then far from the dock at their cabin. Finally, they begged him to head inland so as to at least reach soil to stand on. Some half a mile down from the cabin, the boat found another dock. Jimbo, bottle in hand, approached it with concerning speed. He held up the other hand and said, "Hold on. This is what I call a crash landing." At that, the men perhaps wished to dive and try their luck in the water, but Jimbo insisted. He cut the engine, and purely by force of momentum swung the skiff around so that its bow cracked into the dock and the rest of the boat slid along it to finally make land. The men jumped off in unison and thanked old Jimbo in passing. "Y'all shouldn't be out here this time of night anyhow." Once Justin had told his story, everyone fell back to their beds. By the morning, George was none the worse for the night's interruption. The girls were a little incredulous, though some believed the story. George was jealous of the other men's added clout with them, but decided he had made the right choice in staying behind. The rest of the week passed, sweet and refreshing like the flowers set on the banks further down the river, towards Penzerd. Her house was on the top of the hill back home, unseen from the valley, but blessed with a view thereof, festooned with daisies and daffodils. The road home passed that sweet secret path at the bottom of the hill, where each day George hoped to get just a glimpse of her taking the laundry out or saddling Macabre, her ebon stallion. Most of the town felt the Hemmings were above them, but honest people knew the family never thought that of themselves. In springtime, going back and forth, George would roll the window down and breathe a full bouquet of wet lavender and hot butter rolling down from up on that hill. Too many years had passed since then to warrant comfort in returning, but the memory of that lustrous clan and their ravishing daughter Starlock is a balm to the heart of any who knew them until their last day. That house rambled like a festival by day and glittered as a many-faced lamp at night, a beacon for those who might pass by. It amply conveyed the gaiety and true light found within. If you were their friend, they could hardly turn you away should you pop in at night, nor would they want to. It was said once, and only once, that the house was built for a noted physician as a summer home. It could not have been more providentially sound. From the rear, it overlooked a grand hill that rolled down to meet the mighty Urso River. The house seemed for many the true capital of Penzerd. Many a church luncheon and pool party was set there. George often dropped by with night descending and found himself being invited to sleep in one of a host of guest rooms. Summers would wind their days to a churning, lethargic climax as he'd surrender with open arms to slumber beneath a humming cut-glass ceiling fan. Starlock, their middle child, was a heart-stopping and breaking beauty. When staying over the Hemmings mansion, it was a deep-seated hope that once George might glimpse her, as he often did, or so help him speak to her. It wasn't often their paths would cross. Occasionally, he wouldn't see her at all. But those times he was able to spend in her company were like the sudden appearance of a rare and lost bird. Starlock's presence was so joyous that George was rendered mute so as not to scare her off into distant reaches of the house. Those were the older days when their orbits had not yet collided. There was a neighborhood that always seemed under a noon sun. A ring of white and off-white houses, 12 or so, were positioned round a large circle of grass. 2 years after the fateful trip to Mount Bronze, George was fortunate to have been invited to what was known as the House of the Sun. Its resident was a friend from college, Helia. While he was there for coffee and donuts with her, George noticed a really unique phenomenon while the sun's light gleamed from dogwood blossoms outside the living room window. As the corona grew, a different expanse appeared, as if one photograph were being developed on top of another, replacing the original. No longer did he see a trim yard and neighboring house, but an inclined street in an active city. After a moment, George placed it as Northern Urso. Then he turned to the kitchen window. Through white curtains, he saw the sky cut by a chimney stack. As if a cloud passed before the sun, these silent visions reverted. Helia inquired about his curiosity. George could only stammer some confusion and then smile and return to the crumb-topped donut at hand. Her face was darling and freckled, her hair on the cusp of golden redness, like the first view of evening at quitting time. When the coffee was done and the conversation on late World War II strategy dwindled, they hugged and he left. As he came down the steps, he passed the gallant mailman on his way up. His eyes clearly noted a strange detail, but the mind hadn't considered it until that evening. On an envelope addressed to Helia, 2 streets were listed. At the Almonds farm, the sunflowers and wild ones grew monstrous in their plots. The summer night parties were raucous, and several girls in dresses leapt among bright green, orange, and yellows that pressed close and almost threatened to consume them. These frolics would play out under the high spotlights perched on the array of barns. George's neck and arms held lingering kisses from the sun. Even in winter, those great flowers would launch from the snow on tall stems to defy the ice and cold, peppering the frosty hillside with cool sugar tones. George thought of up north, past Penzard and Mount Bronze, where Prescardia was. Things were said to be cool and often wet there, and the sun would sometimes tear through onto the blue-gray stone of the ranges. Rocks as big as houses lay at the foundations. These were the stones of creation, from which all other stones were exiled. So he had been told at the time, only having seen that region in stark photos which made the rock faces look like monster hides. In the summer, the winter was a world away. He stood watching the others open one cask of cider too many. Quick, before Farmer Almond throws the hay fork at us. George took another look at the squeaking girls veiled among the maze of flowers and felt the joy of those times. He approached the thick walls of the garden. At some point it became too much, he thought, too much life crowding them in. The air was smothering with it. He reached his hand through the curtain of green and grabbed an ivory arm, dewing, like his, with sweat. She yelped and he pulled her out, the aqua-patterned dress like camouflage for a deep jungle bird. Starlock never came to those night parties at the Almonds. George would never confess that he went to them either, let alone had stolen kisses in the barn with a flower girl freshly plucked from the garden. George tasted her honey-glazed lips in between bellowing nostril breaths. Did Stephen open the hive again? George asked. He had seen the cunning fellow pass around honeycomb while the sun set. Amber giggled. George only wanted her that night. Before he'd gone on the trip to Mount Bronze, it was Amber he had pined for back in Middle Penzard. His arm was cinched around the thin fabric on her waist. The straw-smelling air in the barn was on them like wool. Amber was that girl for many of the guys in Penzard. They used to comment on the color of her hair, how much it resembled her namesake. Her eyes were bright green, like a cat's. They were the brightest objects in the barn. All this lasted only a few memory-etching moments of twin kisses before they slinked out the door. The night was warm, but cooler than the barn. He returned Amber's smile. "I'll think about it," she said. Then she walked back to the other flower-clad girls. Each sat in a distinct posture of exhaustion on a row of tree stumps. George hoped to see Amber at Claude's diner that week. There was always the possibility of Justin snatching her up, though. He could see it then. Amber Cartwright and Justin Delegondo were inevitable. George took his leave and carried himself back home, down the gravel road. The sharp light from the Almonds farm sank away while he walked into a hillside full of tall grass. To the right, the town of Cherry, lights out. Somewhere the Green Lion whistled. To the left, the hill went up into a wall of black pines. The silvery clouds were low and swinging lower, at least he felt so. Finally, the moon made its entrance, as if to ask, "And where were you tonight, George Salt?" As the tired young man walked towards his home, so yawning and born with shadows, he realized for once he was empty of ambition or vision. The tired mind can scarcely see ahead. Now such a lot would be very welcome, full of promise. Yet at the time, if it weren't for that lone house and the field which beckoned him in, he may have just wandered off into the darkness of the forest. After that night, he felt he could never be Starlock's, and she was only going to seem farther away because of it. But they were destined to be closer than before, an orbit rare as when the sun crosses the moon.